Today, we are taking a close look at the concept of terroir in beer. That is, the factors that contribute to a beer's expression of place and identity. Soil, climate, terrain, and brewer's technique. These are some of the things that contribute to how we experience beer as a final product. So who better to join us than keynote alum and friend of the show, Kaylin Kirkpatrick, who is Technical Brewing Projects Manager at the Brewers Association and a visiting lecturer at Cornell. Kaylin, as always, so happy to have you back on the show and so glad we were able to schedule this on Denim Shirt Day.
That's right, Chris. It's really great to see you again. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Audience, you are joining us from sunny but chilly Ithaca, New York, which is home to Cornell University. Kaylin, where are you joining us from today?
I am joining you all from Fort Collins, Colorado, which is about north of Denver, about an hour north.
Perfect. Great. As you suggested, spring is starting to take shape here. It's happening here in New York. We're very excited. So let's get into it. Viewers, I want to welcome you all. A couple quick notes. This event today is being recorded. Yes, you're joining us live, but it will be viewable at this very same URL afterward. So if you have to leave early or you want to share this with friends to watch later, just come to the same place and the recording will be available just a few minutes after we're through. You may submit questions in the chat. I'll be taking those questions throughout. So if you open up the dialog box at the top right of your video player, that's where you can not only comment, chat, interact with other people in the keynote today, but most importantly, submitting questions for Kaylin Kirkpatrick throughout our discussion. We will be sharing URLs and resources, several in the chat, so heads up for those as they come your way. If you're watching the archived recording, however, those links are available in the overview section just below the video player here. So let's get started. Let's begin with a little bit of interactivity. I want to find out who's in the audience today. So let's kick off our first question here. I want to ask you, audience, where are you joining us from? I know that we will probably have a sizable domestic audience. However, invariably, hopefully some of our friends from around the world are checking in with us and watching the keynote. I always like to get a sense of who's in the audience, who's going to be joining us. We have several follow-up questions after this, so I'll stand by for a second for the votes to come in. And I am not seeing any votes come in. Yeah, no idea. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so for those of you who haven't seen a QR code, sorry about that. So yeah, but I see that these are coming in now. So we've got people joining us from New York City's winning. We got New York State. We've got Iowa, Maryland, Georgia, Madrid. There we go. Bogota. Very nice to see. London. Beautiful. Shenandoah Valley. Kind of from all over the place. Holy Cross, Iowa. Shout out there. Rochester, New York. There we go. Good. So very well balanced audience here. New York wins today with 3 votes. So thank you for joining us. New York City, New York State comes in strong second. Jersey showing up. Atlanta, Canada. Thank you. It's good to know who's in the audience, primarily a domestic crowd. This one's a little more fun. How would you describe your relationship to beer? Please enter your answers here. You can select multiple choices. I hope that most of us are beer lovers and something else. So we'll see how these questions shake out. We've got a lot of beer lovers. I suspect, Kaylin, that that's what we're going to end up with victory-wise. But the choices are homebrewers, hobbyists, brewery startups, equipment vendors, malt supplier, homebrew retailer, a brewery apprentice, somebody who's in the beginning of their career, aspiring brewery employees. There's even an answer, it's complicated, the relationship to beer. So we'll see how that goes. Looks like it's complicated is actually coming in second place. But primarily we are dealing with, we're at 80% beer lovers here, Kaylin. Home brewers and hobbyists. Brewery employees, we're at about 20% or so there. It's complicated for nearly everyone, but we've got a lot of home brewers in the audience. So this is good to know. Thank you, audience, for your input there. And one final question here. I really love this one. What is your favorite beer style at this very moment, right? I know for me, it jumps around, it skips around. I wouldn't say that I'm an IPA versus a Pilsner guy. I really do generally enjoy most types of beers, so we'll see what happens here. Pils coming in strong so far. Sour making a strong showing. IPAs, as suspected, running a tight second with Pilsners, Porters, Sours, Pale Ales, Hazy IPAs, and so on. Hazy coming in several forms, Hefeweizen, Belgian ales. Cool. So pretty sophisticated beer-loving audience here. Tastes are all over the map, but I got IPA and Pilsner running away with this one. So there we go.
That makes sense. That makes sense, Chris. I think IPA continues to be one of the most popular styles. I'm still waiting for Pils to make a comeback, but maybe that's coming soon.
It looks like it is. Pilsner and IPA are tied at 12. I was going to ask you about that. I mean, that's an obvious trend. You look at beer consumption data and production data. Pils is this is a real thing, right? As far as its emergence as a new favorite.
Yeah, and it might be tied to some of the preferences for more lower strength options. We see this really interesting trend right now where people either really want something with a lot of alcohol or very little alcohol content. So Pilsner maybe tends to fall lower in that category. So perhaps that's one reason why.
Perfect. Thanks, audience, for chiming in. Always, you make this much more interesting than if it were just me running things here. So, Kaylin, let's talk about the work you do as Technical Brewing Projects Manager at the Brewers Association. What is the Brewers Association? What do you do there?
Sure. Yeah. So the easiest way for me to answer this question, because I get it all the time, is that our role at the Brewers Association is to protect and promote American craft beer. So we do a lot of work that falls underneath that umbrella. I happen to work in the technical department with my team. We really focus on providing educational resources, primarily around safety and quality. So we work with industry volunteers, we work with contractors, we put together publications, and we also host the largest Brewers Conference in the US. That's the Craft Brewers Conference. And that will be in Minneapolis in May. So open invitation to all of you beer lovers out there to please attend. And we also run the American Homebrewers Association. So that's kind of our hobbyist arm of the Brewers Association. And we have many members all across the US. It's a great community and another great place to just learn more about beer. So we have our hands in a lot, but I'm very focused on technical brewing, so the actual process of making beer.
Right, exactly. And you've been a beer educator for some time. Cornell still likes to claim you as our own. I hope you don't mind that. You're a visiting lecturer at Cornell. You are a faculty author of the eCornell certificate program called Craft Brewing. This is a certificate program for, essentially all the people that we saw here, working either as hobbyists or working in the industry as well. Those courses may suit you, and certainly a great place to get started with craft brewing, whether it's professionally or personally, on a hobby level or a vocational level. So certainly check those out. We'll share the URL in the chat for you. Let's get to why we came here today to talk about terroir. Classically, the definition of the term terroir has been kind of the purview of wine people. You hear terroir spoken about mostly in wine circles. Kaylin, when we first met and kind of put this thing together, wanted to talk about how terroir may apply to beer. But let's look at the fundamentals really quickly. We have a slide here. Just to reiterate, terroir is made up of 4 influences, generally speaking, right? This is from Foodie Hong Kong is the source of this image. So we're dealing with climate, we're dealing with terrain, which could involve north or south facing aspects, elevation, altitude, obviously figure into terrain. We've got soil, which is kind of its rock and mineral deposits, the density of the soil, and then the traditional part, right? The technique, everything that's involved with, in this case, on this slide, we're seeing a winemaker bottom right, but in this case, it's a brewer, right? So Kaylin, as a brewer, how do you think about terroir? Does it kind of adhere to the same framework? And how do you think about terroir when you think about making beer?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, Chris, and it's something that brewers have been asking more and more, especially as we see an expansion of some of these brewing ingredients across the United States, such as barley and hops. And It's somewhat similar, I would say, to how we've traditionally thought about terroir in the wine world. We have all of these inputs for the agricultural ingredients, hops and barley, that are affecting the flavor and the characteristics that they lend to beer. So yes, we have the climate, we have the soil, terrain, we have the growing practices on farm. Maybe even we have the microbial communities that are associated with those plants in that region. But it's a little complicated, right? Because we are not in the brewing industry. We're not just working with one agricultural input. We're not just working with grapes. We're working with barley that has been malted. We're working with hops that have been dried and potentially processed in some way. We're working with a plethora of different yeast possibilities. And then you also start to look at, that microclimate, that ecosystem in the brewery itself and how that can influence the beer. So there's a lot of nuance here, but it's something we're really interested in looking at and being able to better characterize what that regional identity is for beer.
Perfect. So let's baseline the conversation. Let's talk about our first agricultural ingredient in beer, malted barley, right? Or malt, as you call it, right? So for clarity, barley is a grain. The malting process. Let's talk about the malting process. How do you treat barley? And I don't know. Tell me how you think about malt as a brewer. Some of the ways you can kind of describe its attributes when making brewing decisions.
Sure. Yeah. So this is really glad you brought that up, Chris. It's important for everybody to know that we don't typically brew beer with raw barley. It would not necessarily make a good beer. It would take a lot of work to provide the yeast with what it needs to ferment and make beer. So the majority of our beer is brewed with malted barley, which is actually another craft, an additional step that adds value to the barley before we use it. In the malting process, we are encouraging that grain to wake up a little bit and release some of those sugars and flavors that we want to capture in beer for the yeast and for beer flavor. And there's really two broad categories of malt that I like to talk about. There's base malts and specialty malts. And base malt is going to be a little bit more expressive, perhaps, of the varietal character of that barley. And maybe that's where terroir kind of comes into play here. Base malts make up a large percentage of the malt bill and that recipe for any beer. And specialty malts are treated a little bit differently in the malting process. So they are intended primarily to provide things like depth of color and flavor to the beer. And so they're used in much smaller amounts, but they have really strong, intense flavor characteristics to impart. And so we're seeing kind of a mix here of malt influences in beer flavor and the terroir of both the barley growing region and that varietal, as well as the influences coming from the maltster and the way they have chosen to treat that malt.
How about the viability of barley across the climates within the U.S.? Where is it primarily grown? Are we able to grow barley everywhere, or what's the deal there?
That's a good question. So we aren't easily able to grow barley everywhere. Mm-hmm. There's actually two barley harvests that can be produced in 1 year. There's a spring and a winter barley, and certain regions are more capable of that than others. Most of the barley in the United States is grown in the high plains. So like looking north of Colorado here, so Montana and the Dakotas. There's a lot of barley grown in Canada. The United States is actually a pretty small barley producer when you look at overall global barley production. We don't even make the top 10. So in fact, we do have quite a bit of imported barley and malt into the US. However, there are more and more breeding efforts to adapt barley varieties to all of our different climates in the US. To ensure that the quality of that barley is appropriate for malting and that it can be used in the brewing process. So I know New York State, Cornell has been working to look at adapting some varieties for New York State.
Yeah, exactly. I'd seen some recent studies on that work that's done at the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences where you worked. Let's move on to ingredient number 2. Let's talk hops. So most of us know how prevalent and hop forward beer has been at this point, something like over 20 years. But let's baseline this conversation too. So what are hops? How are they cultivated? I know that it can be relatively tricky. It's a very sensitive type of crop. There's certain methodologies and timeliness that come with it. But tell us a little bit about hops and how you think about hops in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is more of my specialty because I did my graduate work focused on hops. Hops are the fruiting body of the plant, the hop plant. So in the image you're seeing right now, you see a little hop cone. That's the fruiting body, and that's what brewers use to flavor their beer. Hops are what we consider a specialty crop, whereas barley is more of a commodity crop. It takes quite a lot of infrastructure and care and management to successfully grow hops at the commercial scale. So they're strung up on these poles, so that immediately makes them a little bit harder to grow, to train around that vine, and also to harvest at the end of their growing season. So there's specialized equipment and processes just to manage the hop through its growth. And then once the hops are harvested by machines typically, and then processed through a picker, they are, unless the brewer decides to make a fresh hop beer, they're typically dried down to lower moisture content, and they may be further processed. They oftentimes are pelletized, so they're ground into this fine powder. They're pressed into pellets that allows us to store the hops for a longer amount of time, and really encapsulate a lot of those oils and a lot of those flavors. So typically in the brewing process, hops are going to be used either on the hot side to contribute bitterness to beer. So they'll be added to the boil kettle typically, or hops can be used in the cold side. What I call the cold side is like when we're fermenting the beer or after the beer has been fermented and it's a cooler temperature. And that more delicate extraction allows hop aromas to come through in the finished beer. So we have a lot of different techniques available to us to add hop flavor to beer. Those are just two of the main ones that brewers typically use.
When I mentioned that hops can be kind of an intensive process, right? What's their there's a lot of sensitivities. How sensitive are they to molds, to blight, to climate change related variables and things along those lines? It's my impression that it's a really pretty delicate proposition. Is that actually the case?
Yeah, I would say so. So the majority of the hops grown globally are in the United States. And over 70% of the hops that we grow in the US are produced in Washington state. Most of these are going to be in Yakima, so it's a pretty dry part of Washington. These fields are drip irrigated, and there's less pest pressure in that part of the U.S. versus other parts where hops are being reintroduced, like in New York State, where it's more humid and we may have more pest pressures and disease pressure. It's a little bit easier on that end when hops are grown in Washington. However, something that has been an emerging issue are the wildfires happening on the West Coast.
Sure.
And some of that smoke from the fire has been found to penetrate into the hops themselves and transfer into beer. And this was, known by the wine industry for quite some time. California's been dealing with this. Australia's been dealing with it. It's a little bit newer for us in the brewing industry. And so we're still trying to find ways to manage that as we potentially see more wildfire events in the future.
Yeah, certainly something that's impacted the wine industry quite a bit, right? With all that smoke making its way across wine growing regions all over the country, it's starting to kind of manifest itself in a real way, and people are getting real about this. Next ingredient, let's talk yeast. To baseline the conversation, yeast are single-celled microorganisms classified as members of the fungus kingdom. Yeast is serious business. Here we've got a slide of you investigating some yeast in a vessel with colleague Anna Catherine Mansfield. let's talk about yeast a little bit. How do you consider yeast? What are the things that you kind of walk around concerned with when dealing with yeast and brewing?
Sure. Yeah. So I like to refer to yeast as tiny brewers because they're the ones actually making beer. We keep them happy. We feed them sugar and they produce alcohol and CO2 in the fermentation process. These days, most brewers are purchasing yeast from a supplier, and there's many different both species and strains available that can be used in the brewing process. Typically, we work with ale or lager strains, but there is something that can be said about certain beers that like to invite wild yeast from the environment. For example, beers that are produced using cool ships where the windows are opened and you're inviting in whatever microflora is just floating around in your environment. Maybe it's coming from the farm field next door. You're not quite sure what it is, but it's lending unique character and flavor to that beer, and ultimately contributing to its regional identity in some cases. So yes, I would say yeast can also contribute to that regional identity. It's a little bit harder to put our finger on, right? Because we can't really see it and work with it the same way that we can with hops and with malt. But it's there, and it contributes quite a lot to certain beer styles in terms of their flavor.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, the wild yeast / sour beer experience was a revelation. I was very excited about it. I know that it introduces so many variables and difficulties in operationally just for consistency and so on, but certainly something to be appreciated. I mean, is that a thing that's been taking hold in an increasing way, or has it kind of been kept in check with the way that people traditionally make beer in the country?
I think any brewer is always concerned at some level about contamination, especially when you start bringing in different yeasts into your production facilities. So one of the things that brewers focus on the most is actually cleaning and sanitation and making sure that the yeast they intended to ferment that beer is going to be the main player there. So it's really going to help them to control the flavor and really produce the beer as intended when they're keeping a close eye and managing all of the different yeasts in their brewery, whether they're sour or whether they're normal traditional yeast strains like an ale yeast.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so we're talking about terroir. Water is obviously a huge component of beer. Can't make it without it. D. Williams asks us, so does water fit into this discussion as well? So tell us a little bit about how brewers think about water, whether it's preserving what's kind of comes with the water out of the earth, or filtration techniques, or how do you think about water in your educational endeavors, whether it's some of the Cornell courses or some of the work that you've done at the Brewers Association?
Yeah, water. Thanks for that question. By the way, water is one of the most important and essential ingredients in beer. It actually takes about 5 to 10 liters of water to produce even 1 liter of beer. So we use water in the brewing process. We use it for a lot of cleaning operations. And even now, if we zoom out a little bit, right, we use water for agricultural ingredients too. So it's a big player, and brewers are very aware of this and managing their water source closely. I just spoke to a brewer a couple days ago who gets his incoming water tested every other week, just so he knows what the quality of that is coming in and how to treat that so that it delivers the right flavor characteristics to his beer. So in some cases, brewers might strip everything from the water and add back certain minerals to create a certain mouthfeel and flavor in a beer. In other cases, brewers may decide to, really leverage the source of their water because it has unique characteristics specific to that region, and just work with it as it is. One of the challenges in the brewing industry is that across the United States, we have differences in where water comes from. Is it snowmelt? Is it groundwater? It may be affected seasonally, and brewers might experience some differences in the flavor seasonally. It could be impacted by wildfire events again. So brewers are paying close attention to this and need to make sure that they can secure enough water so they have the supply and that the quality coming in is going to meet their expectations. So very important ingredient in the brewing process.
What about water scarcity regulations around water usage? I'm thinking about California. I'm thinking about Washington out west too, right? Where you mentioned that, hop cultivation obviously depends on use of a certain amount of water, and you're getting into irrigation situations and so on. But how do we think about water as it relates to climate change, scarcity? Where do you see things going as it relates to water and beer making? Because there must be some sense of panic out there.
Oh, this is a tricky question. I don't know if I have a great answer for you today, but we're absolutely monitoring this. There's a number of coalitions who are working with both local and federal government to make sure that water is clean and it's secure in enough quantity for our small businesses like breweries. So it's something that we are paying attention to more and more. The Brewers Association actually is devoting some funds this year to put together an RFP for water risk assessment for brewers. So this is a big project that we'll be undertaking over the next couple of years, and I'll have more for you next year if you want to follow up on that.
Perfect, thank you. When I think about terroir and wine, there's specificity and I think you'll understand what I'm getting at here. A sense of geographic place is key to the whole thing, right? This grape was grown on this side of this river at this elevation, facing the sun at this aspect. The soil is made of this, the drainage, you know what I mean? Some people can actually taste wine and say, this is within a 10-mile, a sommelier or a master sommelier can say, this is from within a 10-mile stretch. It's this kind of wine. I know it because that's what I'm experiencing here. Do brewers even aspire to draw ingredients from a singular geographic area? Is that a thing that people care about within the brew world? Is it even possible? I don't even know. In Colorado, can you produce all ingredients for beer agriculturally from where you sit?
Yeah, so in Colorado, with our climate, the biggest challenge is hops. And we do have a good amount of barley production. We have local maltsters here, but we have a very small growing region that's capable of supporting commercial hops at scale. So the challenge for brewers in a state like Colorado who maybe want to use 100% local ingredients is, sourcing the hops in quantities that they would need to do so. So other, states are maybe better positioned to do that around the U.S. But, going back to your question on regional identity, if you will, there's a lot of beers that are European styles that work with traditional European malts, that work with noble hops. You wouldn't brew a Bohemian Pilsner with Citra hop. You would use something like Saaz. So this is something that brewers are already very well versed in. The thing that is a little bit more new and exciting is how, we've developed all these new ingredients, these new hop varieties in the United States. How can brewers kind of use that to create a sense of place? How can, brewers in New York State work with hops grown in New York to communicate that there's some regional identity to the beer that they brewed with New York State ingredients? Anecdotally, we know that there are differences between farms growing the same varieties of hops in Washington State. Brewers go out there for hop selection every fall, and they'll pick their favorite farm that they want to source hops from because it has some characteristic flavor that they're going for. We don't have a whole lot of science to back this up yet, but there are some studies going on at Oregon State University to really look into some of these differences between farms, between states in the Pacific Northwest, and try to put some numbers around it, try to understand how the chemistries are different and why that relates to, how the sensory is different and maybe then how the beer flavor is different.
Perfect. I want to take a quick break and invite our audience to submit questions. It's been a while since I've done that. So again, to reiterate, in the chat dialog box over on the right, submit your questions. I'll take them throughout. I have a couple here. I'm not sure I understand this one from John, but I'm going to ask you to field it. John asks, do hops have disinfecting properties?
Okay, yes. So when we talk about hops' ability to um, inhibit microbial growth, that's really coming from the acid content in the hop. So those compounds that contribute to what we taste as bitter compounds. They also have some antimicrobial properties. So this is actually one of the reasons why hops were traditionally used in beer for so long, because they lent it some preservation qualities.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Isn't that where IPA comes from, right? To kind of sustain the beer's life over an ocean voyage or something? Is that mythical? I don't even know.
Yes, something like that.
We've got to get our beer to India. This is how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's have a little diversion. I want to talk about the craft brew industry at large. You work with brewers all over the country. I think it's fair to say that we all understand that there's tremendous growth in the industry. I want to run a couple stats by you and see what you think about this. So I was looking at the Brewer Association state craft beer sales and production statistics. Again, by state. This is from 2020, fairly recent data. New York has 460 craft breweries. That's 4.1 per capita. That's per 100,000 people of drinking age. Colorado, relatively comparable. 433 craft breweries across the state, 10 per capita per 100,000 people of drinking age. So this represents millions and millions in economic impact. How much longer do you? I guess I don't want to ask you to get in the prediction business, but I mean, what is the state of craft breweries? It's been growing for a while, and it's happening seemingly at an exponential rate these days. What's your experience? And what about your membership? I mean, you must be seeing membership go up in proportion with some of these rates.
Yeah, so we actually have an entire member services team here at the Brewers Association who's watching that really closely and making sure that we're providing the right value to our members as well. That question is really hard about, how many more breweries can we accommodate? But I always say more, because the trend continues to climb. I mean, it may not be quite as exponential as it was 10, 20 years ago, but even now we're seeing increasing amounts of breweries opening. We have around 8,500 craft breweries in the United States, which is, I mean, if someone had told me that 10 years ago, I would just be floored. A lot of this is an interesting statistics that I can share. We at the Brewers Association represent about 5,500 craft breweries in the United States. And a large majority of our members are producing beer at less than 600 barrels a year. And so the size of that operation is equivalent to, your neighborhood brew pub. It's a community space where people like to gather and meet over a beer. And so it's so wonderful to see all of these small businesses contributing to their communities, popping up all across the US, revitalizing, different areas. And so, it's continuing to grow, and we'll continue to provide support for craft brewers as long as we can.
Perfect. A couple good audience and viewer questions coming in right now. Jacob at CSU asks, what do you think the potential is for farm to glass breweries in a la restaurants or vineyards and so on in the same style? Would that be desirable from a market standpoint, or would the cost make it unfeasible? I mean, I think I know what Jacob's getting at. How did that question strike you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so this business model does exist, right? And in New York State, actually, right, there's some farm breweries that are growing most of their own ingredients. It can be challenging, and especially given the nature of growing hops. And all of the infrastructure required to produce those for commercial value, and to get that return on investment, that's going to be a big challenge. So I haven't looked at the numbers, and I don't want to promise anybody that this is the business model that's going to be the way to go, but it's done. It's done in some places well. I think it's hard to do, though. And I think it's hard to do on a small scale to produce these quality ingredients that you would need for your restaurant. You can you can source them locally though. That may be the next best option, is to try to work with your local farmer.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's so many other concerns. People get into the business with a certain set of competencies and abilities and operational strengths and so on. But it's pretty tourist dependent, in my experience, is kind of how you have to make that work. You have to be really good at on-premise sales, and then somehow keep your retail machine going on the other side. It's just a tremendous amount of challenges. I admire anybody that does it. It's done quite a bit around here, and that's how people get around that, right? We're just going to source our hops locally or off premise and deal with it that way. So yeah, you got to be creative for sure, right? Good question in from Marlene. Barrel aged beers are lately becoming popular. Any thoughts on barrel aged beers, Kaylin?
Thoughts on barrel-aged beers? I do enjoy them. I think, they're certainly a niche beer that is popular. I don't know how to tie this into terroir, but you could certainly, we could have a whole hour talking about the different char levels and the different barrel, the wood and the barrel, and how that contributes to beer flavor. There's so much that you can do to really color that palate. So I would say I enjoy this beer style. I would love to see it grow a little bit more. I'd love to try new different styles with different barreling techniques. I don't know what else to say about that. It's a great style of beer.
No, that's great. Good question from Marlene. Thank you so much. Another question in from viewer Robin Lynn, who asks, this is a great question. It's related to standardization in labeling beer, something or another. What are the standards that allow an IPA to call itself an IPA? Does the Brewers Association have any involvement in these standards? Are there standards? I don't know. I think knowing America and our history in calling things like pink Chablis, and they're not pink Chablis. You know what I mean? So how does this apply to beer? Are there conventional standards for alcohol percentage? I don't know. How does this work?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. In the beer world, we tend to be a little bit more loose and experimental with styles and innovating our flavors and ingredients. The Brewers Association publishes beer style guidelines. So I wouldn't call them standards, but they are guidelines based off of research and input from the brewing community, as well as certified beer judges. And so this is one maybe source of truth you could consult. There's some other guidelines out there. For IPA, there are suggested, alcohol content. There's going to be a range of, what is suggested for hop aroma intensity and bitterness quality. And you can consult the Brewers Association guidelines for free to check that out on any beer style that you brew or that you enjoy drinking.
Perfect. Questions still coming in. Kurt Hewer asks, with raw ingredients, as the processors get larger and the methods get more refined, do we lose some of that terroir compared to smaller, more mom and pop maltsters and hop growers? So scalability as it relates to terroir. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is interesting, especially considering that, in a larger scale operation, you might have more homogenization of that ingredient, or maybe some blending that would kind of normalize some of those differences you might otherwise see between farm to farm. So that's certainly an interesting question. I don't have any data to back that up, but anecdotally, that does make sense that you would see greater levels of variation potentially coming from smaller producers and smaller farms. And if that's interesting to you, if there's some nuance there that you want to capture in a beer, or some regional identity working with that smaller farm, then I think that's very cool.
Yeah, and probably more of an inclination to an experiment, right? Stakes are lower. You can kind of play around with things quite a bit when you're a smaller operation. Right.
When you're making a beer that is flagship, that your beer drinkers expect to taste the same way, look the same way every time, and you're distributing across many states, you want that incoming ingredient to be consistent, right? So working with some larger scale operations might lend themselves better to that, but not necessarily.
Yeah. I want to go back to when we talked about domestic U.S. growth in craft beer production, people getting into the business. I just couldn't help but be curious what's going on internationally. Is there an explosion of craft beer internationally, or is beer taking off in new and unexpected places? I'm thinking about our friends in Bogota, elsewhere, who are joining from other places around the globe. In your estimation, I know you're primarily domestically concerned, but what's going on elsewhere?
Yeah, beer is brewing all around the world, right? We don't just do this here in the US. There's a lot of craft beer in Canada. There's a lot of beer in general produced in China, certainly in Brazil, Mexico, all over the world. I don't have a great grasp of what those exact numbers would be for what we would call craft smaller brewers. And in fact, the definition of a craft brewer could vary globally. Here in the United States, we have our own way of thinking about that. But yeah, it's certainly interesting to see craft beer growing around the world and to try some of the really interesting, innovative beers that are being produced.
Exactly. A lot of best practices to share, and right, we've seen so many more people, kind of go through the experience, so everybody can see it as a viable business as they see fit. Question from Daniel Mack comes in. I've started seeing triple IPAs and quadruple IPAs be released. According to the guidelines, again, if there are any, are these real styles or flashy attention grabbers? What do you think, Kaylin?
Well, we have a such style as an imperial IPA, which is probably, I'm guessing, getting at that. It really just depends on the market. It depends what people want, what brewers are interested in experimenting with. The Brewers Association certainly isn't setting any kind of rules or standards around what can be done. The sky's the limit. It's always to be determined if something's a passing fad or if it'll stick around. But certainly when we review the beer style guidelines every year, we look at whether or not some of these newer styles like juicy hazy IPAs are in fact sticking around. And if they are, we'll attempt to capture that and describe it within the guidelines that we publish.
Right. And, you do have metrics to run around with. So if you look at a can or a bottle of beer, the degree to which they are hoppy or otherwise is often labeled, and people will say, oh, well, that one suits me. Right. You know what I'm talking about.
Right. Yeah. And some of it is, some of it's marketing and trying to communicate different approaches and unique flavors to beer drinkers on the can or on the tap menu. So it's all kind of how you tell that story too, Chris. No matter what exactly is in your beer recipe, how you communicate that to the drinker and how you tell that story, it's going to be really important.
There's a question that comes in from Gloria, which kind of opens the door to several other questions. She asks, so is gluten-free beer considered a beer? So, with that, right, its terroir has in some ways been compromised. How do you think about gluten-free beer? There's certainly an explosive demand for it. How do you think about it from a production standpoint or operational standpoint, marketplace, and so on? Thoughts on gluten-free beer?
Oh, that is a tough question. And it depends if you're the TTB or if you are describing your beer to a beer drinker. The TTB has pretty straightforward guidelines on what a beer is and isn't. And a beer needs to have malt in it. And if a gluten-free beer doesn't have barley malt in it, is it necessarily a beer? Mm-hmm. I've had some very delicious gluten-free beers. There's a brewery here in Colorado that I know of that works exclusively with non-barley grains and produces beers with things like buckwheat as the grain to ferment on. So there's some really interesting flavor characteristics there. It's certainly a popular style for beer drinkers that need to stay away from gluten for one reason or another. Mm-hmm. And it actually is a beer in our beer style guidelines that we evaluate and judge at our beer competitions every year, the Brewers Association. So I'd say, yes, it's a beer. It can be very delicious, but depends who you ask.
I'm going to throw a bit of a knuckleball. We didn't even talk about this before, but I can't help but ask, how has the pandemic, recent economic situations, how has it affected breweries, beer making, beer sales? I think I know some of the answers to some of these questions, but I don't know. Any profound issues that kind of come up among your Brewers Association members? Any common threads, anxieties or otherwise among your membership?
Yeah, absolutely. We work with the supply chain quite a bit within the technical department. We actually have a supply chain subcommittee made up of industry volunteers all across the U.S. So we do a lot of communicating back and forth with them, and we also work closely with our supply chain partners in aluminum cans or malt or hops, whatever brewing input that is. And as with any industry right now, the supply chain has continued to be a challenge for brewers. One of the biggest challenges has been aluminum cans, getting their hands on the quantity that they need, the type that they need. Another big challenge for brewers has been CO2. There have been some issues sourcing CO2, depending on where your brewery is located around the country and where that CO2 is being captured from. And most recently, we've had some issues with the malt coming from the 2021 barley harvest, which was not as good as we had hoped for. And unfortunately now too, we're looking at some issues with global trade and sourcing malted barley that brewers need here in the U.S. So the supply chain is continuing to be really the biggest challenge for brewers, for craft brewers right now. And it's something that the BA is monitoring really closely and doing what we can to communicate with all the members of the supply chain and let people know what's going on and, try to help however we can, whether that's by educational resources or, talking to policymakers and finding ways to ease the situation.
Perfect. It's funny that you mentioned the aluminum can supply chain snag and crisis that we're dealing with. It also takes us to a kind of a thought-provoking question from Robin Lynn, who asks, what sells craft beers? Its graphics or its taste? And I think what Robin's getting at is that beer labels have been getting really wild last few years. Certainly a stroll through the craft brew section. It's a feast for the eyes. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? I don't know. Any quick takes?
Oh, yeah. I don't know that this is my area of expertise, but certainly we've found that the quality and flavor characteristics of beer it has to be good. It has to be something that the beer drinker enjoys, right? And is balanced. So I tend to think that is king, but of course, someone has to pick that up off the shelf. And with so many options these days, everybody's competing for shelf space. And so absolutely, the way you market and display your beer is going to have a really big impact as well. So, I don't know which one is more important than the other, but it's sort of a chicken and the egg situation.
I think it is too. I mean, I welcome the innovations in artwork, and it's an absolute blast to see some of the crazy beer names. And we're at a creative peak as far as that goes. It'll be interesting to see where it goes into the future. New question from Javier checks in. Do you think that consumers will find added value when regional identities are added into the final product, something like using or creating the beer terroir as a differentiation element? I'm thinking about some trends, and I don't know if I'm going down the wrong path here, but a New England style IPA, a New York State style cream ale, something along those lines. Do you think regional identity is a thing that people are concerned with?
Yeah, so we could maybe tie this to consumers' interest in supporting and purchasing locally made goods, right? So some of it has to do with, a beer drinker perhaps wanting to support their local economy, wanting to connect and support with their local farmers and producers and brewers. So there's certainly a positive sentiment there when you can associate the product that you're buying and enjoying with the community around you. And I think that's a piece of it, of this regional identity. And then I think another piece could be that, a particular region offers certain characteristics and qualities and flavors, and that might be desirable in and of itself. And so, we see this already with hop varieties, right? A lot of savvy beer drinkers will look for certain hops in IPAs. And, maybe someday in the future, they will also look for hops grown in a specific region. That's something that growers have yet to really capitalize on. But I'll be really interested to see what beer drinkers think about that, if they're willing to pay more for that, or if that's something that they would even seek out. These are some of the unanswered questions with Beer Terroir that are currently under investigation.
Well managed. So I'll give you a break from some of my rapid fire tough questions, because I've been hitting you with a few that are not easy to answer. Good questions from our audience, by the way. Always thought provoking, and thanks for chiming in on that. So that brings us to my favorite segment called What Did You Bring? This is where we both bring something that we think is cool. In this case, it's beer. Kaylin, what'd you bring today? What are we into?
I am pouring it right now, Chris.
Okay.
I brought a Scottish ale.
Okay. Who's this brewed by?
Stodgy.
All right.
Okay.
Perfect.
So this is a very, very malt forward beer style. And I chose this beer because they are my neighborhood brewery. They're right down the street. And the maltsters are actually friends of mine. And they're also here in Fort Collins, Troubadour. And the barley that was malted was grown just east of here. So for me, this is tying in really well with our whole conversation around a sense of place. This is my Fort Collins hometown beer from Stodgy.
Is this where you ride your bike to go get a couple of beers after work?
It's one of the spots.
It's on the beer tour. Okay, what did I bring? I brought something from Industrial Arts in Garnerville. They have two breweries, one in Garnerville and one in Beacon, New York. For those of you unfamiliar with their geography, down in the Hudson Valley, beautiful down there. We have something called Yes Farms, Yes Beer. Here's the beer. I think we have a graphic to display of that one. There it is. Cool. Speaking of flashy labels, from their website, this latest banger is 100% New York grown hazy IPA that combines our hop fetish with our mission to promote local agriculture. It's bursting with pineapple and lemon meringue, and on goes the marketing language. So here we go. I'm going to taste this one for the first time. You mentioned that you know these brewers from downstate.
Jeff O'Neill, I believe, is the co-founder of Industrial Arts. So really excited to see you featuring his beer here. I wish I was sharing a glass of this with you.
I know. Hats off to Jeff for nailing this one. This is absolutely delicious. It's fantastic. So we'll share the website for both of these beers. If you happen to be in Colorado, check out the Stodgy Brewing URL. I wasn't sure which beer Kaylin was going to bring today, so I included a generic URL to their beer. And then I've got one to share for this Yes Farms, Yes Beer from New York State. Absolutely delicious. Great expression of terroir. I'm totally digging it. It's right on the money.
Yeah, I'm getting notes of like caramel and biscuit. It's nice and smooth and deliciously malt forward. So I had a hard time choosing which beer I was going to show up with, Chris. So that's part of why I didn't tell you until last minute.
Perfect. Well, a couple things. Here's the next steps, audience. Thank you for your contribution to questions and just coming today to enjoy this. I hope you got something out of this. In just a moment, I'm actually going to run a survey by you. I want to know how we did today, what you thought of the show, give us a rating, and also how we can improve or anything that jumped out at you as something especially valuable in your experience with today's keynote. So with that, Kaylin, Kirkpatrick, great to see you as always. Cheers.
You as well, Chris. Nice to see you.
We'll see you next time. Thank you, audience. We'll see you for the next keynote. Kaylin, take it easy. We'll see you soon. Audience, stick around for the audience for the survey, please. I'm going to launch it right now. Perfect.